a dying father, a bitter daughter, and a past filled with mistakes that can't be erased. When a nurse lashes out, blaming her own father's cancer on his sins, she thinks the story is over. But what she doesn't expect is to find him spending his last days in the children's ward, reading stories, holding tiny hands, and showing a tenderness she never thought he had. The man she swore she'd never forgive begins to change before her eyes. But is it too late? As old wounds rip open, shocking truths about his past surface. Truths that challenge everything she believed about who he was. Can a broken father find redemption before his time runs out? And will his daughter find the strength to forgive before it's too late? The fluorescent lights hummed overhead in the sterile examination room as Earl Thompson shifted uncomfortably on the paper-covered table. His weathered hands, marked by decades of construction work, gripped the edge until his knuckles turned white. The room felt too small, too clean, too quiet. Dr. Martinez cleared his throat, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses as he studied the test results one more time. Earl knew bad news when he saw it coming. He delivered enough of it himself over the years to recognize that careful expression, that slight hesitation. "Mr. Thompson," the doctor began, his voice gentle but firm. "I'm afraid the tests show what we suspected. You have stage 4 pancreatic cancer." Earl's throat went dry. The words hit him like a sledgehammer to the chest. But he kept his face neutral, the way he'd learned to do when facing problems on construction sites. "Give it to me straight, Doc. How long?" Dr. Martinez leaned forward in his chair, maintaining eye contact. "Without treatment, we're looking at 3 to 6 months. With aggressive chemotherapy, we might extend that to..." "Numbers, Doc. Just the numbers. Perhaps a year, possibly a bit more. But Mr. Thompson, I want to be clear about the quality of life during treatment. It's going to be..." Earl raised a calloused hand, cutting him off.
"I've poured concrete in 100-degree heat and worked through winters that'd freeze the beard off Santa himself."
"I can handle whatever's coming." But even as the words left his mouth, Earl knew this was different. This wasn't like fighting through a tough day at work or pushing through physical pain. This was his life, measured now in months instead of years. The doctor continued explaining treatment options, but Earl's mind wandered to faces from his past. His late wife, Martha, gone too soon. His daughter, Rachel, who worked somewhere in this very hospital, probably tending to patients with the same gentleness her mother had shown. Rachel, who hadn't really spoken to him in years, not since Martha's funeral. "Mr. Thompson?" Dr. Martinez's voice pulled him back to the present. "Do you have any questions?" Earl rubbed his chin, feeling the rough stubble there. "Yeah. How do you tell someone you've spent years pushing away that you might not have time to make it right?" The doctor's expression softened. "Is this about your daughter? The nurse? News travels fast in a hospital, I guess." Earl managed a weak smile. "Would you like me to have someone from our counseling service speak with you? They have experience helping families through these conversations." Earl shook his head. "No, this is my mess to clean up." He stood up, his joints protesting the movement. "But I appreciate the offer, Doc." Dr. Martinez handed him a folder thick with information about treatment options, support groups, and next steps. Earl took it, knowing he'd probably read every word later tonight in his empty house, trying to make sense of it all. "We should schedule your first treatment consultation as soon as possible," the doctor said, reaching for his calendar. "I'll think about it," Earl replied, tucking the folder under his arm. "Need some time to process this." The doctor nodded, understanding. "Just don't take too long. Time is, well, you understand." Earl did understand. Time had always been his enemy, hadn't it? Time wasted on anger, on pride, on stupid prejudices that had cost him his family. And now, time was running out. He made his way through the hospital corridors, his work boots squeaking against the polished floors. Every face he passed, nurses, patients, visitors, seemed to blur together. He wondered if any of them knew Rachel, If they'd heard her stories about her bull-headed father who'd pushed everyone away. The elevator doors opened, and Earl stepped inside, grateful to find it empty. As it descended, he caught his reflection in the metallic walls. When had he gotten so old? His face was more lined than he remembered, his hair grayer. He looked like his own father near the end, and that thought sent a chill through him. The main lobby was busy with the afternoon rush. Shift changes, visiting hours, the normal rhythm of hospital life. Earl paused, scanning the faces, half hoping and half dreading to see Rachel. But she wasn't there, and he wasn't sure if that was a blessing or a curse. He pushed through the revolving doors into the afternoon sunlight. It was too bright, too cheerful for the weight he carried now. Cars passed on the street. People walked by chatting on phones. Life continued as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. Earl stood there, squinting against the glare, the folder heavy under his arm. Somewhere in this building, his daughter was working, probably bringing comfort to strangers while the gulf between father and daughter remained as wide as ever. He thought about going back in, finding her unit, forcing the words out. Rachel, I'm sick. Rachel, I'm sorry. Rachel, I don't want to die with things between us like this. But he couldn't make his feet move. The words stuck in his throat like the gravel he used to shovel. Instead, he stood there, feeling the warmth of the sun on his face, remembering a time when Rachel was small enough to ride on his shoulders, when her laughter was the best sound in his world. Before he let bitterness and prejudice poison everything good in his life, the sound of ambulance sirens in the distance snapped him back to reality. He had to tell her, but not today. Today, he needed to figure out how to carry this news himself before he could share its weight with anyone else, even Rachel, especially Rachel. Rachel Thompson moved through the pediatric ward with practiced efficiency, checking vital signs and adjusting IV drips. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a neat bun, her scrubs pristine despite the long shift. 17 years of nursing had taught her how to maintain composure, even when exhaustion tugged at her edges. Rachel! Lisa, one of the newer nurses, hurried toward her with wide eyes. Did you hear? Your father's been admitted. Rachel's hands froze on the chart she was updating. The pen pressed too hard against the paper, creating a dark blot. What? Her voice came out sharper than intended. I overheard Dr. Martinez talking to administration. Lisa leaned closer, lowering her voice. Something about cancer. Stage 4, I think. The words hit Rachel like a physical blow, but she forced her face to remain neutral. Years of practice hiding her feelings about Earl Thompson served her well now. I see, she said, her tone clipped. Well, that's hospital business, not mine. Lisa's expression shifted to confusion. But he's your father. Biologically, maybe. Rachel turned back to her chart, hoping Lisa would take the hint. But the younger nurse lingered. I didn't mean to upset you, Lisa said softly. It's just, well, everyone knows how dedicated you are to your patients. I thought you'd want to know. Rachel's grip tightened on her pen. Memories flooded back unbidden. Her father's harsh voice, his cold disapproval, the way he'd pushed away anyone who didn't fit his narrow view of the world. The empty chair at her nursing school graduation. The awful things he'd said at her mother's funeral. Trust me, Rachel said. Earl Thompson doesn't want my dedication. Never has. Down the hall, other nurses gathered in small clusters, their voices carrying in that particular way that meant gossip was spreading. Rachel caught fragments of their conversations. Thompson's father. Cancer diagnosis. Such a shame. Karen, a senior nurse who'd worked with Rachel for over a decade, approached with sympathy written across her face. Rachel, honey, I just heard. Are you okay? Something inside Rachel snapped. All the carefully contained resentment, all the years of maintaining professional distance while working in the same hospital as her father, burst free. Okay? She let out a bitter laugh. Why wouldn't I be okay? Your dad's cancer is karma. The words echoed down the hallway, bouncing off sterile walls and linoleum floors. Several heads turned, Someone gasped. Rachel felt the blood drain from her face as she realized how loud she'd been, how far her voice had carried. Karen's expression shifted from sympathy to shock. "Rachel, I didn't," Rachel stammered. But there was no taking back the words now. They hung in the air like poison. "That's not like you," Karen said quietly. "You're better than that." Rachel's hands began to shake. She shoved the chart into its holder with more force than necessary. "I need a break," she muttered, turning away from Karen's disappointed gaze. The walk to the break room felt endless. Every face she passed seemed to judge her, though she knew most of them couldn't have heard. But they would soon enough. Hospitals ran on gossip as much as medicine sometimes. Her father's face flashed in her mind, not the harsh, judgmental expression she was used to, but the one from her earliest memories. The daddy who had once pushed her on swings and taught her to ride a bike, before the prejudice took over, before he became someone she couldn't recognize. The break room door felt heavier than usual as Rachel pushed it open. Her legs trembled as she stepped inside, the fluorescent lights suddenly too bright. Had her voice carried this far? Had he been somewhere in the hallway? Hearing his daughter wish death upon him, she pressed her hands against the cool surface of the break room table, trying to steady herself. The woman in the reflection of the microwave door looked foreign to her, pale, shaken, eyes wide with the realization of what she'd done. This wasn't the compassionate nurse she'd worked so hard to become. This wasn't who her mother had raised her to be. Rachel sank into a chair, her legs no longer able to support her. The break room's familiar smell of coffee and disinfectant couldn't mask the bitter taste of regret in her mouth. She'd just wished death on a cancer patient. Not just any patient, but her own father, in a hospital where she'd spent her career trying to heal people. The quiet hum of the vending machine seemed to mock her professional facade, her carefully constructed walls of indifference toward Earl Thompson. One piece of news had shattered it all, revealing the hurt child still crying out for daddy's love underneath. Her hands wouldn't stop shaking as she reached for her phone, not sure who she planned to call or what she could possibly say. The device slipped from her trembling fingers, clattering onto the table. The sound made her jump, her nerves raw and exposed. What if he had heard? What if those words, harsh, unforgiving, unworthy of her profession, were the last ones he'd ever hear from his only daughter? The thought made her stomach clench. Cancer was a cruel enemy, one she'd watched too many patients battle. Even the ones who deserved better than Earl Thompson had ever been. The morning sun filtered through the children's ward windows, casting cheerful patterns on the linoleum floor. Earl Thompson stood in the volunteer break room, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he arranged juice cups on a plastic tray. The purple volunteer vest felt strange over his flannel shirt, so different from his old construction gear. "Here, let me show you the balloon animal technique again," said Martha, the volunteer coordinator. Her silver hair caught the light as she demonstrated twisting the long balloon. "The kids love these. Just remember, gentle pressure." Earl's thick fingers fumbled with the balloon, and it popped with a sharp crack. He flinched, embarrassed. "Sorry about that." "No worries," Martha smiled, handing him another. "Everyone pops a few at first. Try again." This time, Earl managed a wobbly dog shape. It looked more like a wounded snake, but Martha clapped anyway. "There you go. You'll be a pro in no time." Earl gathered his supplies, juice cups, balloons, and a few picture books Martha had suggested. His stomach churned, partly from nerves, partly from the growing discomfort he refused to acknowledge. The doctor had wanted to start treatment right away, but Earl had other plans first. In the ward proper, children's artwork decorated the walls, bright crayon suns and stick figure families. Some beds were empty, their occupants at therapy or tests. Others held small figures hooked up to beeping machines, their parents dozing in nearby chairs. "Good morning, everyone," Martha announced. "We have a new friend joining us today. This is Mr. Thompson." Several kids looked up with interest. A little girl with a pink headscarf waved shyly. Earl cleared his throat. "Morning," he managed, his gruff voice softer than usual. "Anyone want some juice?" At the nurse's station, Rachel was updating patient charts when movement caught her eye. She glanced up and froze, her pen hovering above the paper. Earl, her father, was carefully pouring apple juice into a plastic cup while a young boy in a wheelchair watched. What was he doing here? She watched as Earl handed over the cup with surprising gentleness. "There you go, buddy. Careful now. It's full." The boy grinned, revealing missing front teeth. "Thanks, mister. Can you make animals with those balloons?" "Well," Earl rubbed his neck, "I'm still learning, but I'll give it a try." Rachel couldn't reconcile this scene with the father she knew. Yet here he was, patiently twisting balloons for children of all backgrounds, his face softening when they laughed at his clumsy attempts. "I didn't expect to see him here," Karen whispered, joining Rachel at the desk, "especially after yesterday's diagnosis." Rachel shook her head. "I don't understand. He should be starting treatment, not—" She gestured vaguely at the scene before them. Earl had settled into a chair now, a picture book open on his lap. 3 children gathered around, drawn by his deep voice as he read Where the Wild Things Are. His dramatic growls for the monster parts made them giggle. "Sometimes people surprise us," Karen said quietly. "Maybe this is his way of—" She trailed off as Tommy, one of their long-term patients, approached Earl. The 6-year-old's head was bare from chemotherapy, his small frame thin beneath hospital-issue pajamas. He stood watching Earl for a moment, then simply climbed into the man's lap. Earl stiffened for a second, clearly startled. Tommy looked up at him with those huge brown eyes that could melt the hardest heart. "Can you be my grandpa? Just for today?" Rachel saw her father's face crumple slightly, tears gathering in his eyes. His hand, when it came up to stroke Tommy's back, was infinitely gentle. "Sure, buddy," Earl whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "I can do that." Rachel pressed a hand to her mouth, her own vision blurring. For a moment she glimpsed the father she'd always wanted, tender, nurturing, his gruff exterior cracking to reveal something raw and real underneath. The sight made her heart ache with a confused mixture of anger and longing. Tommy snuggled closer, apparently content with his temporary grandpa, while Earl continued reading the story. Tears tracked silently down the older man's weathered cheeks, but his voice remained steady, bringing the wild things to life for his small audience. Rachel's footsteps echoed sharply against the hospital walls as she marched toward her father. Earl stood in the hallway outside the children's ward, carefully arranging a collection of cheerful drawings the kids had made. His large hands, once so intimidating to her, now moved with surprising gentleness as he pinned each artwork to the bulletin board. "What kind of game are you playing?" Rachel demanded, her voice tight with suspicion. Several passing nurses glanced their way, but she didn't care. Earl turned slowly, his shoulders sagging beneath the purple volunteer vest. "No game, Rachel," he said quietly. "Just trying to do some good while I still can." "While you still can," she gave a bitter laugh. "So that's what this is about? Trying to clean up your conscience before my—" She stopped herself, arms crossed tightly across her chest. "Before I die?" Earl finished for her, his voice matter of fact. "Yeah, maybe that's part of it. But these kids," he gestured toward the ward, "they need something to smile about, even if it's just balloon animals from an old fool like me." Rachel's jaw clenched. "And what about when I needed something to smile about? Where were you then?" Earl's weathered face flinched as if she'd struck him. "I wasn't there," he admitted. I was wrong, Rachel. So wrong. About everything." "Don't." Rachel held up her hand. "Don't try to make this better with a few words and some volunteer work. You can't just—" She broke off as a child's laughter drifted from the ward, bright and clear. Through the window, she could see the boy from earlier, still bald from chemotherapy, showing another patient how to twist a balloon the way Earl had taught him. "I'm not trying to make it better," Earl said softly. "Nothing can make up for what I did, or didn't do. But maybe," he paused, running a hand over his face, "maybe I can leave something good behind this time." "Something good?" Rachel's voice cracked. Like what? Balloon animals? Stories? Where was this caring man when I was growing up? When I needed a father who... She stopped, swallowing hard. Who wasn't drunk? Earl supplied. Who wasn't full of hate and anger? Who could show love? His eyes were red-rimmed but steady. I can't change the past, Rachel. Lord knows I wish I could. But I can choose what I do with whatever time I've got left. Rachel felt tears threatening and blinked them back furiously. It's not fair, she whispered, hating how young she suddenly felt. It's not fair that these kids get the version of you I never had. No, Earl agreed, his voice rough. It's not fair at all. You deserved better. You deserved a real father. A nurse wheeled a young patient past them, and Rachel automatically stepped back to make room. The girl in the wheelchair waved at Earl, her face lighting up. Mr. Earl, are you coming to read us a story later? Earl's entire demeanor softened as he smiled at the child. You bet I am, sweetheart. Got a special one picked out just for you. Rachel watched the interaction, her chest aching with a confused mix of emotions. The tenderness in her father's voice, the gentle way he spoke to the girl. It was like watching a stranger wear her father's face. I have rounds, she said abruptly, turning away. She couldn't bear to see any more of this new, gentle version of Earl Thompson. It hurt too much, knowing what she'd missed. Rachel, Earl called after her, but she kept walking, her shoes clicking rapidly against the floor. She made it to the staff locker room before her composure cracked. Sinking onto a bench, she pressed her hands against her eyes, trying to hold back tears. The image of Earl comforting that little boy earlier kept playing in her mind, along with the way he'd so carefully hung those children's drawings. Where was that man when she'd drawn pictures? When she'd needed comfort? When she'd cried herself to sleep, wondering why her daddy couldn't love her enough to change? Later that evening, Rachel sat at her kitchen table, a cup of cooling tea beside her as she opened her journal. The familiar blank pages offered no judgment as she began to write, her pen moving hesitantly at first, then faster. He was kind to that boy. But can a man like him ever really change? Her hand trembled slightly as she stared at the words. The question felt both angry and desperate, like a splinter she couldn't quite dig out. She'd spent so many years building walls against the pain of his neglect, his drinking, his harsh words. Now those walls felt less solid, damaged by the sight of him being the father she'd always wanted, just not to her. The children's ward buzzed with excitement as Earl walked through the doors, but this time he wasn't alone. Next to him stood a tall black man, with kind eyes and an easy smile, his salt and pepper hair neatly trimmed. The two men carried boxes filled with art supplies and books. You still move slower than molasses in January, Thompson. James Harris chuckled, nudging Earl with his elbow. These old bones of yours getting creaky? Earl's weathered face cracked into a genuine smile. Watch it, Harris. I can still outwork you any day of the week. Rachel froze at the nurse's station, her clipboard forgotten in her hands. She'd never seen her father interact so naturally with a black person before. The easy friendship between the two men challenged everything she thought she knew about Earl Thompson. Miss Rachel, James called out, recognizing her. Your daddy's been telling me all about you. Head nurse at 38. That's something to be proud of. Rachel managed a polite nod, though her mind was spinning. How did this man know who she was? And since when did her father talk about her with pride? Little Marcus, one of the regular patients, wheeled himself over to the men. Mr. Earl, you brought a friend. His gap-toothed grin lit up his pale face. Sure did, buddy. Earl ruffled the boy's hair. This here's Mr. James. We served together in Vietnam. You were soldiers? Another child asked, eyes wide with wonder. James set down his box and pulled up a chair. That's right. Your friend Earl here saved my hide more times than I can count. He winked at the children. Though I had to return the favor once or twice. Rachel edged closer, pretending to check equipment while listening intently. She'd never heard these stories before. Tell us. The children gathered around, temporarily forgetting their IVs and monitoring machines. Earl settled into his usual chair, his movements a bit stiffer than normal, the cancer taking its toll. Well, there was this one time in '71. We were deep in the jungle. Now hold on, James interrupted with a laugh. You're gonna start with that story? Why don't we tell them about the time you got us lost because you couldn't read that map upside down? Earl's face reddened. I wasn't lost. I was taking the scenic route. Scenic route? James howled with laughter. We walked in circles for 3 hours. Good thing I had a compass in my pocket. The children giggled, and Rachel noticed how her father didn't bristle at being teased, something that would have sparked his temper years ago. All right, Earl conceded with a good-natured grunt. But then you have to tell them about the time you thought that monkey stole your boots. James leaned forward, addressing his captive audience. Kids, let me tell you, your friend Earl here wasn't always the nice man you see today. Back then, he was the stubbornest, most hard-headed soldier in our unit. Still am, Earl muttered, but his eyes twinkled. But, James continued, placing a hand on Earl's shoulder, when things got rough, there wasn't anyone else I'd rather have watching my back. The day I got hit, Earl's face grew serious. James, they need to hear this part, Earl. James turned back to the children. I got shot in the leg during an ambush. Couldn't walk. Your friend Earl here carried me for 2 miles through enemy territory to get me to safety. Didn't matter to him that I was black and he was white. All that mattered was we were brothers in arms. Rachel's hands trembled as she gripped her clipboard tighter. She'd grown up hearing her father's racist remarks, seeing his prejudices in action. But here was living proof of another side to him, a side that had chosen friendship over hate in the midst of war. Why'd you stop being friends after the war? Little Marcus asked innocently. The room grew quiet. Earl's shoulders slumped, and for the first time that day, he looked every bit his 68 years. Because I was a fool, Earl said softly. I came home angry at the war, angry at the world. I let that anger poison everything good in my life. He looked directly at Rachel as he spoke, though she quickly averted her eyes. I wasted too many years with anger. James squeezed his friend's shoulder. But you found me again, didn't you? Better late than never. 3 months ago, Earl explained to the children. I was at the VA hospital for some tests. And who do I see but this ugly mug reading stories to the veterans? Who you calling ugly? James pretended to be offended. I'll have you know I was voted most handsome in high school. The tension broke as the children laughed again. Rachel watched as her father and James began unpacking the art supplies, working in perfect sync, as if the decades apart had never happened. They helped the children with their drawings, James telling jokes while Earl made his signature balloon animals. Rachel's mind drifted to all the times she'd condemned her father for his past prejudices. She'd been right about those. They had existed, had hurt people, had damaged their family. But seeing him now with James, watching their genuine friendship and easy rapport, she realized she'd been wrong about something crucial. People could change. Her father had changed, was still changing. She thought about James's story of the ambush, of her father carrying his wounded friend through danger. That man, the one who'd risked his life for his black brother in arms, had always existed inside Earl Thompson. He'd just gotten lost somewhere along the way. The familiar anger in Rachel's heart shifted slightly, making room for something new. Confusion. Perhaps even hope. She watched as her father helped a little girl with her coloring, James teasing him about staying inside the lines. The scene before her didn't erase the past, but it complicated it in ways she wasn't prepared for. The morning sun filtered through the blinds of Dr. Martinez's office, casting thin stripes of light across Earl's weathered face. He sat quietly, his large hands folded in his lap, as the oncologist reviewed the latest scan results displayed on her computer screen. The silence in the room felt heavy, broken only by the gentle hum of medical equipment. Mr. Thompson, Dr. Martinez began, turning away from her screen to face him directly. Her dark eyes were gentle but carried the weight of difficult news. The cancer has spread more aggressively than we initially anticipated. The tumors have grown significantly since your last scan. Earl nodded slowly, his expression unchanged. He'd suspected as much from the increasing pain in his chest and the way exhaustion seemed to seep deeper into his bones with each passing day. There are treatment options we can explore, Dr. O. Martinez continued, pulling out a folder filled with papers. Aggressive chemotherapy combined with radiation might buy us more time. We could start as early as next week, if— No, Earl said quietly, but firmly. His voice, though soft, carried the authority of someone who had made up his mind long ago. Dr. Martinez paused, her hand still resting on the folder. Mr. Thompson, I understand this is overwhelming, but please consider— I've considered plenty, Earl interrupted, his tone gentle despite his words. Those kids in the ward, they've shown me what fighting looks like. Some of them hooked up to machines day and night, still managing to smile. He shook his head slowly. But that's not my path. I've lived my life hard and fast, Doc. Now I want to live what's left of it serving others, not fighting a losing battle. The door opened suddenly, and Rachel stood in the doorway, her nurse's scrubs wrinkled from a long shift. Her face was flushed, suggesting she'd rushed here after hearing about the appointment. Dad, she said, her voice tight with emotion. What's going on? Dr. Martinez glanced between father and daughter, then quietly excused herself, giving them privacy. The door clicked shut behind her. Rachel moved further into the room, her steps hesitant. I heard from Dr. Martinez's nurse that you had an appointment. Why didn't you tell me? Earl's eyes met his daughter's, and for a moment, he saw the little girl who used to run to him with scraped knees, before he'd pushed her away with his anger and prejudice. Didn't want to worry you. Worry me? Rachel's voice rose slightly. I'm your daughter. I'm also a nurse. I should be involved in these decisions. She picked up the folder. Dr. Self. Martinez had left, scanning the treatment options. These protocols, they could help. They could give you more time. More time for what, Rachel? Earl asked softly. More time to lie in a hospital bed? More time to be sick from chemicals? He shook his head. I've found my purpose in that children's ward. Those kids, they've taught me more about living in these past few weeks than I learned in 68 years of existence. Rachel's hands trembled as she held the folder. But you can still volunteer while getting treatment. You can do both. No, Earl said firmly. I want to spend whatever time I have left being fully present for those children. They deserve that much. And what about what I deserve? Rachel's voice cracked. Don't I deserve more time with my father? Now that you're finally— She stopped, tears welling in her eyes. Earl's heart ached at the pain in his daughter's voice. Now that I'm finally what? Now that you're finally becoming someone I could. Rachel couldn't finish the sentence, but the words hung in the air between them. Someone I could forgive. Earl's shoulders slumped slightly. Rachel, I don't deserve your forgiveness. I know that. I was a terrible father. I let racism and anger poison everything good in my life, including my relationship with you. He looked down at his hands, the same hands that had built houses but failed to build bridges with his own family. But these kids, they don't see my past. They just see me as I am now. And somehow, that makes me want to be better. I can't explain it, but every moment I spend with them feels like a chance to put some good back into the world. Please, Rachel whispered, moving closer to his chair. Please, fight this. For me. Earl reached out and touched her hand gently. I am fighting, Rachel. Just not in the way you want me to. I'm fighting to make these last days count. I'm fighting to leave behind something better than the legacy of bitterness I've carried all these years. Rachel pulled her hand away as if burned. So, that's it? You're just giving up? After everything? Her voice broke completely. "After all these years of pushing me away, now that I'm finally starting to see a different side of you, you're choosing to leave?" "I'm not choosing to leave, sweetheart. I'm choosing how to live until I do." Rachel stood abruptly, tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. She looked at her father, this man who had caused her so much pain throughout her life, this man who was finally showing her glimpses of the father she'd always longed for, and felt her heart breaking all over again. "I can't do this," she choked out. "I can't watch you give up." Before Earl could respond, Rachel turned and fled from the room, her footsteps echoing down the hallway. Earl remained in his chair, listening to the sound of his daughter's retreating steps, each one feeling like another moment of lost opportunity. He looked out the window at the bright morning sun, knowing with certainty that he'd made the right choice for himself, even as it caused his daughter more pain. Sometimes, he realized, the hardest part of changing wasn't the change itself, but accepting that it might have come too late for those you loved most. Rachel hesitated in the doorway of the children's ward, her fingers nervously adjusting her nurse's badge. The familiar sounds of beeping monitors mixed with children's laughter, a combination that usually brought her comfort, but today made her stomach twist with uncertainty. Earl sat in his usual spot by the window, his large frame somehow seeming gentler as he helped a young boy with a puzzle. James stood nearby, organizing a cart full of art supplies, his warm presence filling the room with ease. Neither man made a show of noticing her, though Rachel caught the slight smile that crossed her father's face. "Good morning, Rachel," Earl said softly, not looking up from the puzzle piece in his weathered hands. His voice carried no pressure, no expectation. Just a simple greeting that left the next move entirely up to her. Rachel's throat tightened. She managed a small nod, stepping fully into the room. "Morning?" she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. James glanced up from his task, his kind eyes crinkling at the corners. "We've got plenty of activities to go around if you're interested," he offered casually, gesturing to the art supplies. "These little artists keep us busy." A small girl with a bright yellow headscarf caught Rachel's attention. She sat alone in the corner, struggling to hold her coloring book steady while managing her IV line. The sight stirred something in Rachel's chest, that familiar instinct to help that had drawn her to nursing in the first place. "I think I'll just—" Rachel gestured vaguely toward the corner. Earl nodded, still focused on his puzzle. "Hey there," Rachel said, approaching the little girl. "That looks like a tricky spot to color in. Mind if I help?" The girl, couldn't be more than 7, looked up with bright eyes. "I'm trying to stay in the lines, but my hand keeps shaking," she explained, frustration evident in her small voice. "I'm Rachel," she said, pulling up a chair. "What's your name?" "Sophie," the girl replied, pushing her coloring book toward Rachel. "Can you hold it still for me?" "Of course." Rachel carefully steadied the book, watching as Sophie selected a purple crayon with careful deliberation. From the corner of her eye, she could see Earl watching them, his expression soft with something she hadn't seen before. Pride? Maybe. The morning passed in gentle quietness. Sophie chatted about her favorite colors and her cat at home while she colored. Other children drifted in and out of activities, some joining Earl's puzzle corner, others gathering around James for storytelling. Rachel found herself relaxing despite herself. This was familiar territory. Caring for children had always been her sanctuary in the hospital. She knew how to hold an IV line just right, how to adjust a pillow without disturbing careful artwork, when to offer encouragement, and when to simply sit in companionable silence. At one point, Sophie needed help reaching the art cart. Without thinking, Rachel looked up and caught Earl's eye. He understood immediately, walking over with the cart of supplies. Their movements synchronized naturally as they helped Sophie select new crayons, Earl steadying the cart while Rachel managed the IV line, working together as if they'd done this 100 times before. No harsh words were exchanged. No old grievances bubbled to the surface. Just father and daughter, focused on making a child's morning a little brighter. James watched from across the room, his smile knowing but kind. He kept the other children engaged, giving Rachel and Earl space to navigate this delicate new territory. Sophie held up her finished picture, a rainbow-colored unicorn that definitely didn't stay within the lines but sparkled with enthusiasm. "It's for both of you," she declared, pressing it into Rachel's hands, "because you worked together to help me make it perfect." Rachel's fingers brushed against Earl's as they both reached to accept the drawing. For once, neither of them pulled away. The morning sun streamed through the windows, casting warm light across Sophie's artwork. Rachel studied the chaotic swirl of colors, thinking how sometimes the most beautiful things came from coloring outside the lines. Her father stood beside her, his presence for once feeling less like a shadow from the past and more like a steady support in the present. They worked side by side through the rest of the morning, passing supplies, steadying IV poles, offering quiet words of encouragement to their young charges. No dramatic declarations were made. No tearful reconciliations occurred. But in the simple act of caring for others together, something shifted. Subtle, but undeniable, like the first crack of dawn after a long night. The hospital cafeteria buzzed with its usual lunchtime activity. Rachel sat across from James at a corner table, pushing her salad around with a plastic fork. Earl had gone to get more napkins, his own half-eaten sandwich waiting on a red plastic tray. "You know," James said, his deep voice warm and gentle, "your father isn't just the man who saved my life in Vietnam. He's the reason I stayed alive after coming home." He took a sip of his coffee, watching Rachel's reaction carefully. Rachel's fork paused mid-motion. "What do you mean? Back in '71, I was in a real dark place. Lost my job, marriage falling apart." James shook his head, his eyes distant with memory. "One night, I was sitting in my car outside the VA, thinking about ending it all." Earl returned with the napkins, catching the serious tone of the conversation. His weathered face flushed as James continued. "Your daddy showed up out of nowhere, pulled me out of that car, and took me to get coffee. Sat with me all night long." James reached over and squeezed Earl's shoulder. "Wouldn't leave until I promised to meet him the next day, and the day after that." Earl cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with the praise.
Anyone would have done the same, James.
"No, they wouldn't have," James insisted, especially not back then. A white man spending hours talking to a broken-down black veteran? That wasn't exactly common in those days. Rachel watched her father's face redden further. She'd never seen him embarrassed before. Angry, yes, but never shy about attention. It was strange, like watching a grizzly bear try to hide behind a twig. "Your father visited me every day for 2 weeks straight," James continued. "Made sure I got help, got back on my feet, never asked for anything in return." The cafeteria's fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across Rachel's face as she processed this information. Her memory flashed to a different scene. Her mother sitting alone at their kitchen table, mascara running down her cheeks, waiting for Earl to come home from another late night at the bar. The contrast made her head hurt. "But you were drinking then, weren't you, Dad?" Rachel couldn't help asking, her voice sharper than she intended. "I remember Mom waiting up for you." Earl's hands, rough from decades of construction work, wrapped around his paper coffee cup. "Yes," he admitted quietly. "I was. Not proud of it, but I was." James leaned forward. "Life ain't simple, Rachel. Good and bad. They get all tangled up in people sometimes. Your daddy helped me through my darkness, while fighting his own." The cafeteria's background noise seemed to fade as Rachel watched her father. His shoulders were hunched, making him look smaller than his usual commanding presence. She noticed how his hands shook slightly as he lifted his coffee. Was it from emotion or the cancer? She wasn't sure. "Tell her about the supply run," Earl said suddenly, clearly trying to shift attention away from himself. "The one where you pulled me out of that rice paddy." James chuckled, but Rachel noticed how his eyes grew serious. "Your father took a wrong step, ended up neck deep in mud and water. Would have drowned if I hadn't been there. Scared the hell out of me," Earl admitted. "Thought that was it. But you still went back out the next day," James added. When nobody else would volunteer, you said, "Those boys need supplies." Rachel felt something shift inside her chest. She remembered a Christmas when she was 7, how her father had worked double shifts in freezing weather to buy her the bicycle she wanted. He'd been drunk at Christmas dinner, but that bike had been under the tree, wrapped with clumsy love. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting strange shadows across their small table. A group of residents walked past, their white coats stark against the cafeteria's muted colors. Rachel watched them go, thinking about how people could be both heroes and villains in the same lifetime. "I should get back to my patients," she said finally, standing up. Her salad was barely touched. Earl nodded, not meeting her eyes. "Thanks for having lunch with us." James watched them both with knowing eyes. Sometimes, the hardest person to forgive is the one who's both better and worse than we imagined, he said softly. Rachel gathered her things, her mind swimming with conflicting images. Earl passed out on the couch. Earl saving James's life. Earl missing her school plays. Earl working through Christmas Eve. Which version was real? Maybe they all were. That evening, Rachel stood in her apartment's kitchen, staring at old family photos on her refrigerator. One showed Earl teaching her to ride that Christmas bike, his face young and proud. Another captured him at her high school graduation, already looking weathered, a flask visible in his jacket pocket. Which version of him is real? She whispered to herself, touching the photos with trembling fingers. The question hung in the air, unanswered, as evening shadows crept across her kitchen floor. The afternoon sun streamed through the children's ward windows, casting warm rectangles of light across the linoleum floor. Earl sat in an oversized armchair that had seen better days, its fabric worn smooth by years of worried parents and restless kids. Around him, a semicircle of children perched on plastic chairs and wheelchairs, their faces bright with anticipation. And then, Earl read, his gravelly voice rising dramatically, the little engine looked up at that mighty mountain and said, letting the suspense build. "I think I can," shouted Tommy, a 7-year-old with leukemia, his bald head wrapped in a superhero bandana. Earl chuckled, the sound rumbling deep in his chest. "That's right, buddy. I think I can. I think I can." He puffed out his cheeks and made a chugging motion with his arm, causing giggles to ripple through his young audience. Rachel stood in the doorway, her arms crossed, watching. She hadn't meant to stop here. She was supposed to be checking on Mrs. Martinez in room 304. But something about her father's voice had drawn her in. "Higher!" squealed Sarah, a tiny 6-year-old attached to an IV pole. She tugged on Earl's sleeve with her free hand. "Make the train sound higher!" Earl obliged, his voice climbing to a squeaky pitch that seemed impossible coming from such a big man. "I think I can. I think I can." The children collapsed into laughter, and Rachel found herself fighting back a smile. Lucy, a frail 10-year-old who hadn't spoken all week, suddenly pointed at the book's illustrations. "The clouds look like cotton candy," she whispered. Earl paused in his reading, giving her observation his full attention. "They sure do, sweetheart," he said softly. "Good eye you've got there." Rachel watched as Lucy's face lit up at the simple praise. It was the same look Rachel herself had longed for as a child, waiting up late for a father who rarely came home in time to say goodnight. The story continued, and Rachel found herself drawn further into the room. She leaned against the wall, observing how these children, facing battles no kid should have to fight, hung on every word of the silly train story. Their eyes sparkled with hope and possibility, even though some of them could barely lift their heads from their pillows. Tommy raised his hand, his arm trembling slightly from the effort. "Mr. Earl, can you do the different voices again? Like yesterday?" "Well now," Earl said, his eyes twinkling. "I suppose I could give it a try." He cleared his throat and launched into distinct voices for each character. A deep rumble for the big engines, a posh accent for the passenger engine, and a determined squeak for the little engine that could. Rachel watched her father transform the simple story into a performance. His face changed with each character, eyebrows dancing, mouth twisting into exaggerated expressions. Here was the man who had never once read to her as a child, now pouring his heart into entertaining these kids. Sarah, still attached to her IV, carefully stood up and wobbled over to Earl. Without hesitation, he scooped her onto his lap, adjusting the IV line with practiced care. The little girl snuggled against his chest, her eyes heavy with medication but still fixed on the book's pages. "Look at those mountains," Earl said, pointing to the illustration. "Remember what we said about mountains yesterday?" "They're just big hills," chorused several voices. "That's right," Earl nodded. "And what do we do with hills? Take 'em one step at a time." The children's voices rang out with conviction that made Rachel's throat tight. She thought about all the times she'd seen these same kids crying through procedures, fighting through pain, facing setbacks that would break most adults. Yet here they were, believing in a little engine that refused to give up. Their resilience wasn't loud or showy. It was in the way they showed up each day, in their ability to laugh despite everything, in their willingness to hope when hope seemed foolish. Earl turned the page, but Tommy interrupted with a cough. Without missing a beat, Earl reached for the water cup on the nearby table and helped him take a sip. The other children waited patiently, some of them patting Tommy's back or offering encouraging words. Rachel felt something shift inside her chest. These children supported each other through the hard moments, then went right back to enjoying the good ones. No grudges, no bitter memories held tight like treasures. They simply lived in the now, accepting both the struggles and the joy with open hearts. As the story drew to its triumphant conclusion, Earl's voice grew stronger. "I thought I could! I thought I could!" He chugged, and the children joined in, their voices creating a chorus of victory that echoed down the hospital hallway. A nurse appeared with a medicine cart, and the spell was broken. The children began to disperse, some to their beds, others to their treatments. Earl helped Sarah back to her wheelchair, making sure her IV line wasn't tangled. Rachel started to slip away, but a small hand caught her scrub pants. It was Lucy, the quiet one. "Thank you," Lucy said, her voice barely above a whisper. Rachel knelt down. "For what, sweetie?" "For bringing your daddy to us. He makes the best voices." Rachel's throat closed up. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Lucy smiled and walked away, leaving Rachel kneeling on the floor, watching her father carefully collect the scattered pillows and straighten chairs, humming the story's refrain under his breath. The simple gratitude in Lucy's voice echoed in Rachel's ears, along with the impossible weight of the word daddy, a word she herself hadn't used in decades. She stayed there, speechless, as the afternoon sun continued to paint its warm rectangles across the floor, witnessing a version of her father she never knew existed. The evening cast long shadows through the hospital window, turning the stark white walls into a canvas of purple and orange. Earl Thompson lay propped up against pillows that seemed too crisp, too institutional. His work-worn hands, now thinner than they'd ever been, rested on the blanket covering his lap. Rachel sat in the visitor's chair beside him, her nurse's uniform still on from her shift. The steady beep of monitors created a rhythm that filled their uncomfortable silence. She watched as her father's fingers absently traced the pattern on his blanket, a nervous habit she'd never seen in him before. "Remember that treehouse I promised to build you?" Earl's voice was softer than usual, lacking its familiar gruffness. "I bought the lumber. It sat in the garage for 2 summers. Rachel nodded stiffly. She remembered the pile of wood collecting dust, remembered how it became a symbol of all his broken promises. I'd come home from the bar instead of working on it. Earl's admission hung heavy in the air. Figured there'd always be another weekend, another chance. He coughed, a dry sound that made Rachel instinctively reach for the water pitcher. "Here," she said, pouring him a cup. Their fingers brushed as she handed it to him, and she noticed how cold his had become. Earl took a small sip, then set the cup aside.
You know what I think about now? All those Sunday mornings I spent nursing hangovers instead of taking you to church like your mama wanted?
All those times I saw James at the hardware store and crossed to the other side because I was too stubborn, too prejudiced to see him as the good man he is. A nurse walked past the door, her shoes squeaking on the linoleum. Rachel shifted in her chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap to hide their trembling. I used to tell myself I was protecting you, Earl continued, his voice thick with emotion, keeping you away from people I thought were different. Truth is, I was the one who needed protecting from my own ignorance. He looked out the window, where the last rays of sunlight painted the sky. Took Vietnam to show me we all bleed the same color, but I was too proud to admit I was wrong when I came home. Rachel felt tears pressing against her eyes, but held them back. She'd spent years building walls against his excuses, his explanations, but this didn't sound like excuses anymore. Those kids down in the ward, Earl said, gesturing vaguely toward the children's floor. They don't see color or class or any of that nonsense I wasted my life believing in. They just see people who care about them. He turned to face Rachel, his eyes wet. Like you do. You became everything I should have been. Caring, accepting, strong. The monitors beeped steadily as Earl reached for his water again. His hand shook slightly as he brought the cup to his lips. Rachel watched him struggle, but knew better than to help. Some pride still remained. I watch you with those children, he continued after setting the cup down. The way you listen to them, comfort them. You got that from your mama, not from me. I was blind to so much, Rachel. Blind to the hurt I caused. Blind to the love I was pushing away. His voice cracked. And now, time's running out. The words landed like stones in still water, rippling through the quiet room. Rachel felt her carefully constructed defenses wavering. She'd rehearsed this moment in her head countless times over the years, the moment her father might finally acknowledge his failures. In her imagination, she'd remained strong, unmoved, but reality felt different. She watched as Earl wiped roughly at his eyes with the back of his hand, a gesture so familiar it made her heart ache. It was the same way he'd wiped sweat from his face after a long day at the construction site, the same motion she'd seen through the screen door on those nights he'd come home late. I don't expect you to forgive me, Earl said quietly. Lord knows I don't deserve it, but I needed you to know that I see it now. All of it. The man I was. That's not who I wanted to be. Not for you, not for anyone. Rachel stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. The sound seemed to startle them both. She looked at her father, really looked at him, and saw not the imposing figure of her childhood, but a man diminished by regret and illness, trying to make peace with his past before it was too late. I should go, she managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. Your next round of meds will be coming soon. Earl nodded, sinking back into his pillows. He looked tired, spent, as if the weight of his confessions had drained what little strength he had left. Rachel walked to the door, her steps measured and careful. She paused in the doorway, one hand on the frame. Without turning around, she whispered, almost to herself, maybe you've changed. The words floated in the air between them, fragile as soap bubbles. She didn't wait for his response. Stepping out into the hallway, where the fluorescent lights hummed their constant, steady song. The hospital's annual fundraising gala transformed the normally austere cafeteria into something magical. Twinkling lights hung from the ceiling, and round tables draped in white linens filled the space. Medical staff, donors, and community members mingled in their finest attire, their conversations creating a gentle hum beneath the soft background music. Rachel stood near the back wall, fidgeting with the hem of her navy blue dress. She watched as James helped her father navigate through the crowd toward the podium. Earl moved slowly, each step careful and measured, but his head was held high. His suit, which had fit perfectly just months ago, now hung loose on his frame. Still, he'd insisted on wearing his best tie, the red one with tiny sailboats that one of the children had given him. "Ladies and gentlemen," the hospital administrator announced, "we have a special speaker tonight. Mr. Earl Thompson has been volunteering in our children's ward, and he'd like to share his experience with you." The room quieted. Rachel's heart thumped against her ribs as Earl gripped the podium, steadying himself. His voice, when it came, was rougher than usual, but clear. "I'm not much for fancy speeches," Earl began, managing a small smile. "Most of my life, I was better at tearing things down than building them up. I worked construction, you see. But these past few months, these children have taught me about building something far more important than buildings." He paused, taking a careful sip of water. Rachel noticed how his hand trembled slightly, but his eyes remained bright and determined. "When I got my diagnosis, I thought it was the end of my story. Maybe some of you thought it was karma." His gaze briefly met Rachel's, and she felt her cheeks flush hot. "Truth is, you might have been right. I lived a hard life, made choices I'm not proud of, hurt people I should have loved better." The room was absolutely still now. Rachel could see several people dabbing at their eyes with napkins. "But these kids," Earl continued, his voice growing stronger, "they didn't care about my past. Little Tommy with his leukemia, he just wanted someone to make him balloon animals. Sarah, fighting her brain tumor. She only cared if I could do different voices for her storybooks." He chuckled softly. "I learned real quick that my construction hands could build castles out of Legos just as well as they could frame a house." Earl gripped the podium tighter, and James moved a step closer, ready to help if needed. But Earl stood straighter, his voice clear and passionate. "These children taught me that it's never too late to change, never too late to love, never too late to build something beautiful out of the rubble of your mistakes. Every smile I get from them is a brick in something new I'm building, something I hope will last longer than any structure I ever put up." Rachel pressed her hand to her mouth, tears flowing freely now. She saw other nurses she worked with doing the same. "My daughter Rachel works here as a nurse," Earl said, his voice softening. "She's known me at my worst, watched me waste years on anger and prejudice. But she's also shown me what real strength looks like. Every day, she pours love into these kids, even the ones who might not make it. She taught me, though she didn't know she was teaching, that true courage isn't in being tough. It's in being tender when life is hardest." The tears were streaming down Rachel's face now. A colleague squeezed her shoulder gently. "So yes, I'm dying," Earl said matter-of-factly. "But these children, your children, gave me new life first. They showed me redemption isn't earned, it's given. Through their innocent eyes, I learned to see myself differently, to see others differently. They helped me build a bridge back to my daughter's heart, even if I don't deserve to cross it." He paused, taking another sip of water. "This hospital needs your support, not for the machines or the medicines, though those matter too, but for the magic that happens in the children's ward. The kind of healing that goes deeper than bones and blood, the kind that mends souls." Earl's voice grew husky with emotion. "I won't be here next year to make balloon animals or read stories. But I'll tell you this, the time I've spent here has been worth more than all my years of building houses. Because love builds the strongest foundations of all." The room erupted in applause. People rose to their feet, their faces wet with tears. James beamed proudly beside Earl, helping to steady him as he stepped back from the podium. Rachel couldn't stop herself. Her feet were moving before she even realized it, carrying her through the crowd. She rushed toward the stage, her heart pounding. Earl turned at the sound of her approach, his eyes widening in surprise. Without hesitation, without the weight of decades of hurt holding her back, Rachel threw her arms around her father. She felt his thin frame against hers, sensed his surprise in the way he stiffened for just a moment, before his arms came around her too. They stood there, holding each other as the applause continued around them. "Daddy," she whispered, using a word she hadn't spoken in 30 years. And in that embrace, in front of everyone, the wall between them finally began to crumble. The gala's twinkling lights still sparkled in the cafeteria down the hall, but Earl's hospital room was quiet except for the steady beep of monitors. He'd insisted on changing back into his familiar flannel pajamas after his speech, saying the suit made him feel like he was putting on airs. Rachel sat in the visitor's chair beside his bed, watching him doze. The excitement of the evening had worn him out, but a peaceful smile lingered on his face. She'd never seen him look so content. Even his illness carved deeper hollows in his cheeks. "You did good tonight, Daddy," she whispered, testing the word again. It felt strange on her tongue, like a forgotten language slowly coming back. Earl stirred slightly, his eyes fluttering open. "Rachel?" His voice was thick with sleep. "You're still here? Just making sure you're settled in." She adjusted his blanket, falling easily into nurse mode. "That was quite a speech you gave." "Probably talked too much." He chuckled weakly. "Always was long-winded, when given the chance." "No, it was perfect." Rachel smoothed the wrinkle from his pillowcase. "The hospital administrator said donations doubled their usual amount tonight." Earl's face brightened. "Those kids deserve every penny." He shifted, trying to sit up straighter, but something changed in his expression. A flash of pain crossed his features. "Dad?" Rachel leaned forward. "What's wrong?" "Just a little." His words trailed off as his eyes rolled back. His body went rigid. The monitor beside his bed erupted in sharp, urgent beeps. Rachel's nursing training kicked in even as her heart lurched with terror. "Dad!" She hit the emergency call button repeatedly. "I need help in here." Earl's body began to shake. The seizure took hold of him, violent tremors running through his thin frame. Rachel quickly lowered the bed rail and turned him onto his side, supporting his head to prevent injury. The door burst open as 2 nurses rushed in, followed by Dr. Martinez, the overnight physician. Rachel found herself being gently but firmly moved aside as they worked. "BP's dropping," one nurse called out. "Get a crash cart in here, Stat," Dr. Martinez ordered. Rachel pressed herself against the wall, her professional calm crumbling as she watched them work on her father. The room filled with more staff, their voices overlapping in urgent medical shorthand she normally understood, but now seemed like a foreign language. "Push 1 of Epi. O2 stats falling. Get respiratory in here." Through the chaos, Rachel could only focus on Earl's face. The peaceful expression from earlier was gone, replaced by a slack, gray pallor that terrified her. This wasn't how it was supposed to happen. Not tonight. Not when they'd finally started to heal. Dr. Chen, Earl's oncologist, arrived looking somewhat rumpled, clearly called in from home. She quickly assessed the situation, consulting with Dr. Martinez in low, urgent tones. The seizure finally subsided, but Earl remained unconscious. The monitors showed slightly improved readings, but Rachel knew enough to recognize they weren't good. "Rachel," Dr. Chen approached her gently. "Can we step into the hall for a moment?" Her legs felt wooden as she followed the doctor out. The hallway lights seemed harsh after the dimness of Earl's room. "The cancer has likely spread to his brain," Dr. Chen explained softly. "That's what triggered the seizure. We can make him comfortable, but—" She paused, her kind eyes full of sympathy. "I think we're looking at days now, maybe hours. I'm so sorry." Rachel nodded mechanically. Doctor's words she'd heard countless times now hitting her with the force of a physical blow. Can I sit with him?" "Of course. We'll get him stabilized and settled. Then you can go right back in." The next hour passed in a blur of activity. The crisis team gradually dispersed as Earl's condition stabilized, though stable now meant something very different than it had that morning. They gave him anti-seizure medication through his IV, adjusted his oxygen, and added several new monitors. Finally, Rachel was alone with him again. The room was dark, except for the glow of monitors and the thin stripe of light from the hallway. She pulled her chair close to his bed and took his hand. It felt cooler than before. Remember when I was little? She whispered. And I had that terrible flu? Mom was working night shift, and you stayed up with me all night. You kept putting cool cloths on my forehead and telling me stories about when you were a kid. She squeezed his fingers gently. That was one of the good nights, one of the times you were really there. Earl didn't respond, but the monitors showed a slight change in his heart rate. She chose to believe he could hear her. And now here we are, and I'm the one sitting up with you. Her voice cracked. But I'm not ready, Dad. We just started talking again. Really talking. There's so much more I need to say. The tears she'd been holding back began to fall. Please don't leave me yet. I'm not ready. The monitors continued their quiet beeping, marking each precious moment as the night grew deeper. Rachel held her father's hand and waited, caught between the nurse who understood what was coming and the daughter who couldn't bear to accept it. Outside the window, the city lights twinkled like the gala decorations that seemed a lifetime ago now, though it had been only hours. Rachel sat in the darkness, whispering words she'd held back for decades, hoping her father could still hear them. Morning sunlight filtered through the stained glass windows of the hospital chapel, casting pools of blue and gold across the empty wooden pews. Rachel Thompson sat alone in the front row, her nurse's scrubs wrinkled from spending the night at her father's bedside. Her shoulders trembled as she buried her face in her hands. The chapel's silence pressed in around her, broken only by the soft whir of the hospital's ventilation system and her own ragged breathing. The words she'd spoken weeks ago echoed in her mind, cruel and sharp. Your dad's cancer is karma. She lifted her head, studying the simple wooden cross on the wall. It had been years since she'd stepped foot in a chapel, years since she'd done anything more than mumble a desperate pleas during difficult shifts at work. But now, the weight of those hateful words crushed her chest. I didn't mean it, she whispered, her voice cracking. I was so angry for so long. The morning light shifted, and Rachel watched dust motes dance in the colored beams. She thought of her father's hands, once hard and calloused from construction work, now gentle as they held storybooks for the children in the ward. She remembered how those same hands had gripped the podium at last night's gala, trembling but determined as he spoke about second chances. I wasted so much time, Rachel said, louder now. All those years holding on to hate while he was changing, becoming someone different. She stood up, pacing the small chapel, and now he's slipping away. Her footsteps echoed as she walked to the prayer candles near the altar. Each tiny flame represented someone's hopes, someone's prayers. Rachel picked up an unlit candle, rolling it between her fingers. I don't even know how to pray anymore, she admitted to the empty chapel. I spent so long being angry at him, at you, at everyone. She paused, watching the other flames flicker. But those kids in the ward, they taught me something. They showed me who he's become. They saw what I couldn't, or wouldn't. Rachel thought of the little boy who called Earl Grandpa, of the girl who thanked her for bringing your daddy. She remembered James's stories about Vietnam, about how Earl had saved his life too. Layer by layer, these moments had stripped away her carefully constructed anger. I was so sure he couldn't change, she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. I held on to every harsh word, every absent birthday, every time Mom cried herself to sleep. I wrapped myself in that pain like a shield. She found a match and struck it, watching the small flame dance. But he did change. He's not the same man who hurt us. And I'm not the same angry girl anymore either. Rachel's hands shook as she lit the candle, setting it among the others. Please, she said. And this time, it wasn't just a desperate mumble. This was a real prayer, raw and honest. Please give me time to tell him. Let me have the chance to say the words he needs to hear. Tears rolled down her cheeks as she watched the flame steady itself. I forgive him. She practiced, testing the words that had seemed impossible just weeks ago. I forgive him, and I need him to know before She couldn't finish the sentence. Instead, she sank back onto the front pew, watching her candle burn alongside the others. The morning light continued to paint the chapel in shifting colors, and Rachel sat in its warmth, letting the quiet seep into her bones. After a long moment, she wiped her eyes and looked up at the cross once more. Her voice was steady now, as she whispered, "If there's still time, let me tell him. I forgive him." The words hung in the air, mingling with the dust motes and colored light, a daughter's prayer for one more chance to heal what had been broken for so long. Rachel's footsteps echoed through the quiet hospital corridor as she made her way back to Earl's room. Each step felt heavier than the last, her heart pounding against her ribs. The morning sun cast long shadows through the windows, making the hallway feel both warm and somehow lonely at the same time. Outside Earl's door, she paused, taking a deep breath. The steady beep of monitors filtered through the thin walls. She could do this. She had to do this. When she pushed open the door, Earl lay propped up slightly on his pillows, his weathered face pale against the white hospital linens. His eyes were closed, but they fluttered open at the sound of her entrance. Despite his obvious weakness, his face brightened immediately upon seeing her, creating deep creases around his eyes, the kind that come from genuine joy. "Rachel," he whispered, his voice raspy and thin. "You came back." She moved to his bedside, noting how the morning light emphasized the hollows in his cheeks, the gray pallor of his skin. Her father looked so different from the strong, intimidating man of her childhood. Yet somehow, in his vulnerability, he seemed more real, more human than ever before. "Of course I came back," she said, surprised by the gentleness in her own voice. Her hands found the rails of his bed, gripping them tightly. "I've been thinking about everything." Earl's breathing was labored, each breath a careful effort, but his eyes remained fixed on her face. The monitors beeped steadily in the background, marking time like a metronome. "I need to tell you something," Rachel began, her voice trembling, "about what I said, about the karma." Tears welled up in her eyes, threatening to spill over. Earl raised one hand weakly, silencing her. "Honey," he rasped, "you've already forgiven me. I felt it when you stood beside me with those kids." Rachel's breath caught in her throat. The simple truth in his words struck her like a physical blow. He was right. Somewhere between the balloon animals and bedtime stories, between watching him comfort sick children and hearing him admit his mistakes, her anger had begun to melt away. "But I was so cruel," she whispered, a tear finally escaping down her cheek. "I wanted you to hurt like I hurt." Earl's hand found hers, his grip weak but warm. "That's what pain does to us," he said softly. "Makes us want others to feel it too. I should know. I spent years spreading my own pain around." Rachel looked down at their joined hands, his large and calloused, hers smaller but showing the same working-class strength. How many times had she longed for this simple touch as a child? How many times had she watched other fathers hug their daughters and felt the ache of absence? "When did you get so wise?" she asked, managing a watery smile. Earl attempted a chuckle that turned into a cough. When he recovered, he said, "Watching those kids, they taught me more about love and forgiveness than I learned in all my stubborn years." He paused, gathering strength. "They don't hold on to anger. They just love, even when it hurts." Rachel felt something break inside her chest. Not violently, but like ice melting in spring. All the carefully constructed walls, the righteous anger she'd held onto for so long, began to crumble. "I saw you with them," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "The way you held them, comforted them, the stories you told. It hurt because that's all I ever wanted from you." Earl's eyes filled with tears. "I know, baby. I know." His breathing grew more labored, but he pressed on. "I can't change the past, can't give you back your childhood. But watching you with those kids too, you became everything I should have been. Strong, compassionate, You did that all on your own." Rachel couldn't hold back anymore. The tears came freely now, years of pain and longing and unexpected healing pouring out of her. Without thinking, she lowered the rail of his bed and sat on the edge. Then, moving carefully around the tubes and wires, she laid her head on his chest. Earl's hand came up slowly, weakly stroking her hair. The gesture was so tender, so fatherly, that it made her cry harder. She could hear his heartbeat under her ear, still strong despite everything, still fighting. "I forgive you, Daddy," she whispered through her tears. "I forgive you." His hand continued its gentle movement through her hair, and Rachel felt years of tension release from her shoulders as she sobbed against his chest. For the first time since she was a little girl, she felt safe in her father's presence. For the first time, she felt truly loved by him. Rachel stayed there for a long moment, her head against Earl's chest, letting the steady rhythm of his heartbeat calm her tears. When she finally sat up, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand, she noticed Earl looking at her with a peculiar mix of peace and urgency in his expression. "There's something else I need to tell you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Each word seemed to cost him precious energy, but his eyes remained bright and focused. Rachel reached for the water cup on his bedside table, helping him take a small sip through the straw. "Don't tire yourself out, Dad," she said softly, but Earl shook his head. "Need to say this," he insisted, his weathered hand finding hers again. "These past few months, volunteering in the children's ward." He paused, gathering strength. "It's been the greatest joy of my life." Rachel squeezed his hand gently, remembering all the moments she'd witnessed. Her father making balloon animals with trembling hands, reading stories with different voices for each character, holding scared children during difficult procedures. The transformation she'd seen in him had been remarkable. "Those kids," Earl continued, a ghost of a smile playing on his lips, "they taught me what love really looks like. Pure, unconditional." He took a labored breath. "They didn't care about my past, my mistakes. They just accepted whatever kindness I could give." The morning sun had crept higher now, casting warm squares of light across Earl's hospital bed. In the brightness, Rachel could see every line on his face, each one telling a story of his life, the hard years, the regrets, and now, finally, the redemption he'd found. "James," Earl said, his voice growing more urgent, "he understands. He knows how to reach them, how to bring light into their darkness." He tightened his grip on Rachel's hand slightly. "I want you to continue with him. After." "Dad, please," Rachel interrupted, her throat tightening again. But Earl pressed on. "Promise me you'll keep volunteering with James," he said. "Those children need someone to remind them that hope exists, that love exists." His eyes searched her face intently. "You have that gift, Rachel. I've seen it. The way you care for them, the way they trust you." Rachel thought about the children in the ward. Their brave smiles, their resilient spirits, their capacity for joy, even in the midst of pain. She thought about how working alongside her father there had begun to heal wounds she'd carried for decades. "The kids," Earl continued, his voice growing fainter, "they showed me it's never too late to change, never too late to choose love over bitterness." He paused, fighting for breath. "When you remember me, Rachel, don't remember the man I was. Remember the man I tried to become." Tears welled up in Rachel's eyes again as she watched her father struggle to share these final thoughts. His face showed exhaustion now, the effort of speaking, clearly, taking its toll. Yet there was also a profound peace there, as if by speaking these words, he was finally laying down a heavy burden. "I've seen you with those children," he said softly. "You give them the tenderness I should have given you. You show them the patience I never had." His eyes drifted closed for a moment, then opened again with effort. "That's my legacy, Rachel. Not my failures, but what you learn to become in spite of them." Rachel reached out to smooth his hair back from his forehead, a gesture of comfort she'd seen him use countless times with the children in the ward. "I understand now," she said gently. "Why you chose to spend your last months there. Why it meant so much to you." Earl nodded slightly, his energy clearly fading. "Life's funny," he murmured. "Had to learn about being a father from those kids, just in time to leave." His words were becoming slower, his eyes growing heavy. Rachel could see him fighting against sleep, trying to keep his eyes open. She leaned forward, pressing a kiss to his forehead. "Rest now, Dad," she whispered. "I'll stay right here." "Promise me," he breathed, barely audible now. "Promise you'll continue with James, tenturing in the ward." Rachel held his hand firmly, her other hand still stroking his hair. "I will, Daddy. I promise." His eyes drifted closed, his breathing evening out into the rhythm of sleep. Rachel kept hold of his hand, watching the morning sun paint shadows across his peaceful face. The morning light filtered softly through the hospital room's curtains, casting gentle shadows across Earl's peaceful face. Rachel sat beside him, her hand wrapped around his larger, calloused one. The steady beeping of monitors had become a familiar companion over the past few days, marking time as Earl's strength gradually ebbed away. She'd barely left his side, taking breaks only when James insisted she eat something or stretch her legs. The nurses had brought in a reclining chair for her, but she rarely used it, preferring to stay close enough to hold her father's hand and whisper words of comfort. Earl hadn't spoken much since their conversation about the children's ward, but his eyes would occasionally flutter open, finding Rachel's face with a look of contentment that made her heart ache. The anger that had defined their relationship for so many years had dissolved, replaced by a bittersweet peace that felt both precious and terrifyingly fragile. James came by each morning, usually bringing coffee and sitting quietly with them. Today, he'd brought his worn Bible, reading softly from the Psalms while Earl dozed. The familiar words seemed to bring comfort to all of them, filling the sterile hospital room with a gentle grace. Around mid-morning, Earl's breathing changed. Rachel noticed it first. The subtle shift in rhythm, the slight catch in each inhale. She'd seen it before as a nurse, but experiencing it as a daughter was entirely different. Her heart clenched as she realized what was happening. "Dad?" she whispered, leaning closer. Earl's eyes opened slightly, finding her face. The corners of his mouth lifted in the faintest smile. James set his Bible aside, moving to stand on the other side of the bed. His presence was steady, grounding, as Rachel fought to keep her composure. She wanted to be strong for her father in these final moments, even as her heart felt like it was breaking. Earl's fingers twitched in Rachel's grasp, and she held on tighter, as if she could anchor him to life through sheer force of will. But she knew better. As a nurse, she'd witnessed this journey many times, had helped other families through it. Now it was her turn to let go. "It's okay, Dad," she managed to say, her voice surprisingly steady despite the tears gathering in her eyes. "You can rest now. We're here with you." James began humming softly, an old hymn that Rachel vaguely recognized from childhood church services. The familiar melody seemed to relax Earl, his breathing becoming slightly less labored. Rachel watched her father's face, memorizing every detail. The strong line of his jaw, softened now by age and illness. The crow's feet at the corners of his eyes, earned from years of squinting in the sun at construction sites. The scar above his left eyebrow, from a workplace accident decades ago. Each mark and line told a story. Not all of them happy, but all of them part of who he was. The morning light grew stronger, warming the room. Earl's breathing became shallower, the pauses between each breath growing longer. Rachel's world narrowed to those breaths, to the feeling of his hand in hers, to the soft sound of James's humming. Then, with a gentleness that seemed impossible for something so momentous, Earl took one final breath and let it go. His hand remained warm in Rachel's grasp, but she felt the subtle change, the absence of life's tension, the perfect stillness that followed. For a moment, no one moved. The monitor's steady beeping transformed into a continuous tone. But Rachel barely heard it. She stared at her father's face, peaceful in death in a way she'd rarely seen it in life. James's hand came to rest on her shoulder, solid and comforting. "He went out a better man than he came in," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Rachel nodded, unable to speak just yet. She brought her father's hand to her forehead, pressing it against her skin as tears began to fall freely. All the complicated emotions of their relationship, the anger, the hurt, the recent healing, swirled together with grief in her heart. "I love you, Daddy," she whispered through her tears, the words she'd held back for so long finally flowing freely. The morning sun continued to shine through the window, warming Earl's still face. Outside, the world went on as it always did. But in this room, time seemed to pause, allowing a daughter one final moment with her father, letting love have the last word in their story. The morning sun streamed through the children's ward windows, casting warm squares of light across the freshly polished floors. Rachel Thompson stood in the doorway, her nurse's scrubs crisp and neat, clutching a familiar worn storybook to her chest. Her heart quickened as she watched James Harris arranging juice boxes and cookies on the small activity table. "Well, look who's right on time," James called out, his warm smile crinkling the corners of his eyes. "These little ones have been asking about you all morning." Rachel's fingers traced the book's spine. It was Earl's favorite, the one he'd read countless times in this very room. "I wouldn't miss it for anything," she replied, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. As she stepped into the ward, excited whispers rippled through the room. Little faces brightened, some pale from treatment, others flushed with fever, but all lighting up with joy. 6-year-old Tommy, his head wrapped in a colorful bandana, was the first to wave frantically from his bed. Miss Rachel! Miss Rachel! Are you going to read to us today?" he called out, bouncing slightly despite his IV line. Rachel made her way to the familiar wooden rocking chair in the corner, her father's chair. For a moment, she could almost see him there, his weathered hands gesturing as he acted out the stories, his gruff voice somehow perfect for every character. "That's exactly why I'm here," she said, settling into the chair. It still felt warm somehow, as if holding on to the memory of all those who'd sat there before. The wood creaked softly as she rocked, just like it had for Earl. James helped some of the more mobile children gather around her feet on colorful floor cushions. Others watched from their beds, propped up on pillows, while nurses paused in their rounds to listen. "Today's story is about a brave little mouse," Rachel began, opening the book. The pages were soft from use, corners gently worn from countless tiny fingers, pointing at pictures. As she read, Rachel found herself mimicking her father's voices. The squeaky mouse, the booming owl, the silly squirrel. The children giggled in all the right places, just as they had for Earl. 10-year-old Sarah, fighting leukemia, mouthed along with the familiar words from her bed. Halfway through the story, 8-year-old Marcus raised his hand. "You do the voices just like Mr. Earl did," he exclaimed, his eyes wide with wonder. Rachel's breath caught for a moment. James stepped closer, his steady presence anchoring her as it had so often anchored Earl. "That's right," she managed, smiling through the ache in her chest. "My daddy taught me how." "I miss him," whispered little Amy from her wheelchair. Her small hand reached out to pat Rachel's knee. "But I'm glad you're here now." Rachel blinked back tears, touched by the simple honesty of children. "I miss him too, sweetheart. Every single day." James pulled up a chair beside her, his voice gentle. "You know what Earl used to say? He said these story times were the best medicine in the whole hospital." The children nodded enthusiastically. 12-year-old David, the oldest in the ward, spoke up from his bed. He told us stories about when he was young, too. About how people can change and get better inside, not just outside. Rachel's heart swelled. Even now, months after his passing, her father's impact rippled through this room like sunlight on water. She looked around at the young faces, some bearing tubes and masks, others marked by illness, but all shining with the same hope Earl had nurtured here. "Should we finish our story?" she asked, and was met with eager nods. As she continued reading, a peace settled over her that felt both new and familiar. The sound of her voice mixed with the gentle whir of medical equipment and the occasional squeak of the rocking chair. James hummed softly, helping pass out cookies and juice, just as he and Earl had done so many times before. When the story ended, the children clapped, just as they had for her father. Tommy hugged his stuffed giraffe close. "Can you tell us a story about your daddy next time?" he asked, hopefully. Rachel smiled, remembering Earl's last words about leaving something better behind. "I'd love to," she replied. As the afternoon wound down and some children drifted off to nap, little Amy wheeled closer to Rachel's chair. Her dark eyes were serious as she looked up. "Why do you come here every week?" she asked softly. Rachel reached out to smooth Amy's rumpled blanket, just as she'd watched her father do countless times. The answer came easily, flowing from a place of healing she hadn't known existed until now. "Because my daddy taught me love can heal the worst wounds." Rachel closed the storybook gently, smiling at the circle of children gathered around her. Their eyes sparkled with that innocent wonder that had first captured her father's heart. Little Marcus, the boy who'd asked about her weekly visits, snuggled closer to her side. "Time for afternoon meds, kiddos," called Nurse Jenny from the doorway. The children groaned in unison, but Rachel gave them an encouraging wink. "Remember what we say about medicine time? Even yucky stuff helps us grow stronger," they chanted, making Rachel's heart swell. These were Earl's words, part of the daily wisdom he'd shared during his time here. She helped the younger ones back to their beds, tucking blankets and adjusting pillows with practiced care. Each child got a gentle pat or a quick hug, the kind of natural affection that had once seemed impossible for her to give. Sarah, a 7-year-old with leukemia, held onto Rachel's hand a little longer. "Will you come back tomorrow, Miss Rachel?" "Of course, sweetheart. Just like my daddy did." Rachel smoothed Sarah's bandana, decorated with bright butterflies. The gesture reminded her of how Earl would always straighten the children's hair or clothing, showing dignity even in illness. As the afternoon staff began their rounds, Rachel gathered her things. James, who had been quietly organizing art supplies in the corner, caught her eye and nodded. They shared a knowing look, the kind that acknowledged their shared mission to honor Earl's memory. "Good session today," James said softly. Rachel touched the book's worn cover. It was his favorite to read to them. "I found it in his apartment after." She paused, but the wave of grief that usually followed felt different now. Gentler. More like a warm embrace than a crushing weight. Making her way out of the ward, Rachel's footsteps slowed as she approached that familiar stretch of hallway. The same antiseptic smell hung in the air. The same fluorescent lights hummed overhead. But everything else had changed. She stopped at the exact spot where, months ago, she had spat those venomous words about karma. The memory rose up, but instead of shame, she felt something unexpected. Peace. The afternoon sun painted the corridor in soft amber light. Rachel moved to the window, pressing her palm against the warm glass. The hospital grounds below were quiet, with just a few people making their way along the winding paths. "Thank you," she whispered, her breath fogging the window slightly. "Thank you for second chances, for letting me see him as he truly was at the end, for giving us both time to heal." A small hand tugged at her scrubs. Rachel looked down to find Marcus, his IV pole trailing behind him like a faithful companion. "Miss Rachel?" His dark eyes were serious. "Can you walk me to my new room? They're moving me to the sunshine side today." Rachel smiled, remembering how Earl used to call it that. The sunshine side, where the morning light hit first. "Of course, buddy. I'd be honored." She took his small hand in hers, careful of the IV line. Together, they started down the corridor, their shadows stretching long in the late afternoon light. Marcus hummed softly, a tune Earl used to whistle while making balloon animals. "You know what?" Marcus said, looking up at her. "Your daddy told me once that every new day is a gift we get to unwrap. Even the hard days." Rachel squeezed his hand gently, her heart full. He was right about that. He was right about a lot of things. In the end, they walked slowly, matching Marcus's pace, past the nursing station where her colleagues smiled warmly. These same people had once witnessed her bitterness, but now they saw something different. A woman transformed by forgiveness, carrying forward a legacy of love. The hallway ahead stretched bright and clean, leading toward tomorrow. Rachel felt the weight of her father's last request, not as a burden, but as a blessing. Each step with Marcus, each story read, each moment spent in the ward was a tribute to Earl's final chapter, and the beginning of her own. For the first time since Earl's passing, Rachel felt completely certain of her path. The bitterness that had once defined her relationship with her father had transformed into something beautiful, like morning dew catching the first rays of sun. Marcus's grip tightened slightly as they approached his new room. "Will you tell me another story before you go? One about your daddy?" "I'd love to," Rachel said, her voice warm with promise. They stepped forward together, into the gentle light of late afternoon, toward a future bright with possibility. What would you do if you were in their place? Comment your answer below and let's see how you'd rewrite the ending. If you enjoyed the story of Earl Thompson, I handpicked the next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.